If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The heat pressed down over the corral with no wind to cut it. Dust clung to every board of the fence, every nail head, every rope left hanging on the posts. Elias Carver stood at the rail, one boot braced on the lower beam, hammer in hand. He tightened the last plank, wiped his forearm across his brow, and squinted toward the ridge where the road bled into pale sand. That was when he saw her. She came down the slope alone, her stride uneven, favoring one side as if each step jarred her ribs. Her dress, once dyed in bright colors, was torn along the shoulder. A dark seam of blood had dried into the cloth. She carried no bundle, no water skin, only herself. Elias didn't move at first. Years of drifting had taught him to wait before acting. Too many times he'd stepped in when it wasn't wanted, and the cost had always been higher than the help. He stood, eyes narrowed, watching how she held herself. Her chin was high, even while her body bent under pain. When she reached the corral gate, she stopped. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't plead. Her breathing came rough, but her gaze stayed on him, steady, sharp, unwilling to bend. Elias felt something shift inside, the old tension that came whenever a stranger crossed into his space. Fear wasn't exactly the word, but caution sat heavy in his chest. He knew how quick sympathy could turn into another debt he couldn't repay. He looked at her shoulder again. The cut wasn't fresh, but infection rode under the skin. His mind turned to what little he had on hand: water in the barrel, a strip of clean cloth, beans simmering on the stove inside. Not much more. Slowly, he set the hammer aside, reached for the dipper, and hooked it over the rail where she could see it. "Water's here," he said, his voice low, almost flat. For the first time she moved closer, her steps cautious. She took the dipper, drank in short swallows, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then set it down with care. Only then did Elias notice her hands tremble before she tucked them against her dress. He thought of town 10 miles off. They already whispered about him. They remembered the Apache camp, the scandal of a year ago. They said he had no sense, that he walked into trouble and left worse behind. If he let this woman step inside his gate, the talk would swell again. He waited, his need to stay invisible against the plain truth standing in front of him. She was hurt, and turning her away would finish her. Her eyes met his. Not begging, not soft. Just waiting. Elias let out a breath, nodded toward the shade of the tack shed. "You can sit there," he said, "out of the sun. No promise beyond that." But it was enough to draw a small shift in her shoulders. Not relief exactly, but the loosening of someone who had been standing too long at the edge of collapse. She walked to the shade without another word, lowered herself carefully to the ground, and leaned back against the wood. Elias turned back to the fence, lifted his hammer again, and worked with steady strokes. But his thoughts didn't stay on the nail heads. He knew the decision was already made. The sun had shifted just enough for a sliver of shadow to stretch across the yard, and Elias set the hammer down for good. The woman hadn't moved from where he told her to sit. She leaned back against the wall of the tack shed, her eyes closed, but her body still tense, as if expecting to be driven off at any moment. He noticed the way her hand pressed at her ribs, a habit born of pain more than caution. Elias wiped the sweat from his neck with the inside of his shirt and weighed what to do next. Letting her stay in the shade bought her a little time, but time didn't heal infected wounds. He thought about how little he knew. Her name, how she came to be alone, whether someone was following her. The last thought stirred an unease in his chest. Men didn't get cut up and left wandering the flats for no reason. Someone had done that to her, and trouble rarely stayed far behind its cause. He crouched near the water barrel, filled the dipper again, and carried it over. She opened her eyes the moment his boots scuffed the dirt. He noticed that, light sleeper, alert, not the type to close her guard. He held out the dipper. "You'll need more than one drink." She took it without hesitation this time. Her hand still shook, but she steadied herself against the wall and drank. Elias crouched a little lower, his gaze resting on the torn cloth at her shoulder. "You should have that cleaned. Infection's already set in." Her voice came low, rough but steady. Already cleaned it. 3 days ago. I made it this far. Her English carried a certain weight. Not broken, but deliberate. Each word chosen as if she'd learned them through hard necessity rather than comfort. Elias studied her face now that she let him. Younger than he'd guessed from a distance, but not a child. Early 20s, maybe. The lines of her jaw were sharp, her eyes darker than the soil after rain. He saw pride there and a kind of defiance. 3 days with a cut like that, Elias muttered. Surprised you're still standing. I've stood through worse. She set the dipper down and leaned back again, as if the conversation was closed. He didn't press further, but the silence between them didn't feel finished. Elias wasn't used to talking much himself. But with her, there were too many unanswered questions pressing at the edges. Who had hurt her? Was she running from kin, from outlaws, from soldiers? And what exactly did she expect to find at his gate? He realized he was staring and turned away. The beans on the stove would burn if left too long. He walked to the small house, lifted the lid, and stirred. The smell of salt pork carried out into the yard. For a moment he considered eating inside, letting her fend for herself. But the memory of her trembling hands stayed with him. Without thinking further, he carried 2 tin plates out. When he set one down near her boots, she hesitated. Her eyes flicked up to him, cautious. Elias lowered himself onto a crate opposite her and began to eat from his own plate. Only after he took the first few bites did she pick hers up and start. She ate quickly, but not carelessly, cleaning each bite from the tin as though wasting food wasn't an option. Elias knew that habit well. Do you have a name? He asked between mouthfuls. Her eyes narrowed slightly, measuring him. Then, after a pause, Pi. The name hung there a moment, unadorned. No explanation. Elias nodded once. Elias Carver. He didn't offer more either. He had learned long ago that names were enough for a first exchange. After the food was finished, she wiped her plate with the edge of her torn dress, then set it neatly on the crate. Not a word of thanks, but her action spoke as clear as any. As the evening cooled, Elias went about closing the gate and checking the stock. Pi remained in the shade, watching him. He felt her eyes on his back, not heavy, but steady enough to remind him she was still there. When the work was done and the yard was quiet, he carried a folded blanket from the house and set it beside her. Night gets cold out here, he said simply, for long while she didn't move. Finally, she pulled the blanket over her shoulders. Her voice came softer this time. I'll leave at first light. Elias didn't answer right away. He thought about the cut on her shoulder, the limp in her step, the empty look of a person with nowhere to go. He thought about his own past, how the town still whispered that he left a woman behind among the Apache, how he hadn't stopped to argue or explain. He knew how fast a story could spread, and how it could cling to a man no matter what he did after. You'll rest first, he said at last. Decide in the morning. She looked at him as though searching for hidden meaning, then lay down against the wall. Elias lingered in the yard, arms crossed, scanning the horizon for riders or dust. None came. Only when the stars thickened above the plain did he step inside. Sleep didn't come easy. He wasn't afraid of her, but of what followed her, what stories or dangers she carried. Still, he'd made the choice. For tonight, she stayed. By dawn, the air was cooler, though the dust still clung to everything it touched. Elias stepped outside with a bucket to check the stock and found Pahi already awake. She was sitting on the edge of the trough, the blanket folded neatly beside her. Her face was pale in the early light, and though her ribs still made her careful with every movement, she stood without being asked, as if to show him she could. He noticed it right away. She had no bundle, no horse, no sign of carrying anything that could sustain her. The thought raised more questions than he wanted. How had she crossed such distance with nothing? Who had she left behind? And why hadn't anyone come looking? He didn't ask yet. She wasn't ready to answer. Elias had planned to ride into town for nails and cloth before the week turned, and now it felt necessary. Pi needed more than shade and beans. She needed medicine, clean bandages, and clothing that wasn't half ruined. He knew what the town would say, but he also knew what would happen if he let her wound fester. Going to town today, Elias said as he checked the mule's hooves. You'll ride with me. Pi's eyes flicked to his face, measuring whether it was an order or an offer. "They'll look. They always do," Elias answered, fastening the strap tight. "Better you walk in with me than stumble in alone." The ride to town was quiet. Pai sat stiff in the saddle, her eyes scanning the horizon, as if expecting pursuit. Elias kept his own gaze on the trail. He thought about what the townsfolk remembered of him. A cowboy who drifted too long among the Apache, who left behind a woman in trouble that no one spoke about in detail, but everyone hinted at. They'd taken him back, grudgingly, because he worked steady and kept to himself. Now, with Pahi at his side, all that earned ground would start to slip again. The bell above Ruiz's store door rang sharp as they stepped inside. Mrs. Ruiz, gray hair pinned tight, lifted her head from the ledger. Her eyes went straight to Pahi, lingered on the torn sleeve and the stiff way she moved, then cut back to Elias. No greeting, just waiting for his order. "Nails," Elias said evenly. "Sugar. Cloth," he added after a pause, "needle and thread." Mrs. Ruiz nodded, but the silence in the room thickened. Two men by the stove, Carter and Mays, ranch hands with nothing better to do than trade stories, watched openly. Carter muttered something low, and Mays gave a short laugh, not loud, but enough for Pahi to hear. Her shoulders stiffened, and Elias felt a heat climb up the back of his neck. He didn't confront them. He never did. Words only made the stories grow. Instead, he turned to the shelf, picked up the roll of cloth, and laid coins on the counter. The scrape of metal against what sounded loud in the room. Pahi's gaze flicked around the store. She wasn't hiding, but there was something guarded in the way she stood, like she'd learned too many times that open defiance only led to harsher blows. Still, when Carter smirked again, her chin lifted the slightest bit. Elias caught it. That quiet resistance was something he understood. As he tied the bundle to his saddle, a shadow stretched across the porch. Sheriff Calder leaned against the post, thumbs hooked in his belt. Calder was a man who measured others more than he spoke, and right now his eyes rested steady on Elias. "Morning," the sheriff said. His tone carried weight, not unfriendly but edged. "Heard you've got company out your way." Elias didn't flinch. She needed water, needed rest. "That's what folks are saying," Calder replied, looking past Elias to Pahi, who stood by the rail. "But you know how talk runs in this town. Some are saying you're starting trouble again. Trouble you don't need." Elias met his eyes. "She asked for shade. I gave it." Calder studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Just remember, not everyone here forgets as quick as I do. Keep her close if you mean to keep her safe." With that, the sheriff tipped his hat and walked off, leaving the words hanging. Elias tightened the saddle strap and motioned for Pahi to step up. She hesitated, then placed her foot in his palm. He lifted her easy into the saddle, careful not to jolt her ribs. On the way out of town, Elias caught sight of Mrs. Ruiz at the window. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes followed them until the dust of the trail rose high enough to blur them from view. As they rode, Elias thought over what hadn't been asked. Where Pahi came from, why she had nothing, who might still be searching. He knew others in town would ask those questions soon enough, but for now he kept them to himself. He could see the tension in the way she held the reins, half expecting the past to come after her. And though he didn't say it aloud, Elias understood something else. He had taken her into town, let everyone see them together. There was no walking that back. Whatever happened next, their fates had already been tied in the eyes of the town. The road out of town stretched long and empty, the sun climbing higher, burning the dust until it shimmered in waves. Elias rode with his hat low, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Behind him, Pahi kept her back straight in the saddle, her movements careful, not from fear of falling, but because every breath seemed to remind her of the wound beneath the bandage. She didn't complain, not once, though Elias could tell each mile pressed harder on her ribs. For a time, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was practical, the kind of quiet that left space to listen for riders who might follow. Elias checked the horizon often, scanning for dust trails. None appeared. Still, the sheriff's words lingered in his mind. Trouble. The town always saw it first, even when it wasn't there. After a while, Pahi broke the silence. They know you in that place. Her voice was steady, though her eyes stayed fixed on the line of fence posts in the distance. Elias adjusted his reins. They know pieces, enough to make stories. What kind of stories? She asked. He considered leaving it at that, but something in her tone, more statement than curiosity, pressed him to answer. A year back, I lived near the Apache camps. Worked stock, traded, got close with a woman there. Too close. When things turned, I walked out. Left her behind. Town says I brought shame to both sides. Says I don't finish what I start. Pahi studied him from the corner of her eye. Why did you leave her? The question hit harder than he expected. His jaw tightened. He thought about the campfires, the voices raised in anger, the way her brothers had looked at him with hands on their knives. Because staying would have meant blood. Mine or theirs. Either way, it was over. Pahi's gaze returned to the horizon. She didn't argue, didn't pity him. After a long pause, she said quietly, I know what it is to be pushed out, to have your own people say you don't belong. Elias turned his head slightly toward her, watching her profile in the bright sun. Her words explained more than she realized. Why she had no horse, no family, no one following to claim her. She wasn't just running from danger, she'd been cast out. You walked alone 3 days like that? Elias asked, nodding toward her shoulder. 4, she corrected. 3 without food. She paused, then added, they said I was trouble. Said I carried shame. So I left before they could prove it with their knives. Her voice didn't shake, but Elias heard the cost behind it. He knew what it was to carry blame that didn't belong entirely to you, and how people sharpened it until it cut deep. The horses crested a rise, and the homestead came into view, the fence line stretching out like a thin scar across the flatland, the corral, the small cabin with its unpainted walls. Pahi's eyes lingered on it. You stay here alone? She asked. I do. No wife? No kin? Elias shook his head once. Had a brother. Died in Kansas. Parents before that. All gone. This place is what I've got left. The words hung between them, plain and final. Elias rarely admitted them out loud, but saying them now didn't feel like weakness. It felt like an even trade for what she had given him. Her truth sharp and bare. When they reached the yard, Elias dismounted and offered his hand. Pahi hesitated, then placed her palm in his. He lifted her down gently, steadying her when her ribs pulled at the movement. She didn't let go right away, and for a second they stood close, two people who had been left behind by different worlds but had ended up here at the same gate. Elias finally stepped back and untied the bundle of supplies. You'll need better bandages. We'll fix that cut before night. Pahi nodded once. No thanks, no softness, just agreement. But her eyes lingered on his face longer than before, as if marking him not as a man passing through, but as someone she might trust, if only for the next mile of her life. Inside, the smell of beans still clung to the air. Elias set the supplies on the table, lit the lamp against the shadows, and thought about what the sheriff had said. He knew what the town saw, a cowboy who couldn't keep trouble from his door. But as Pahi lowered herself carefully into the chair, silent and steady, he decided the town's talk mattered less than her staying upright through another night. For now, that was enough. The next mornings came early. Elias was used to working in silence, but now the rhythm of the homestead had shifted. When he stepped outside before first light to light the stove and set coffee to boil, Pahi was already awake, sitting near the corral with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't wait for instructions. By the time Elias carried the bucket to the trough, she was at his side, steadying the handle with her uninjured arm so the water didn't slosh out before reaching the corral. Elias watched her closely at first. He expected her to falter, but she didn't. Her ribs still forced her to move carefully, yet her hands were strong and sure. He caught himself wondering if she'd worked stock before, if her people had kept horses the way she seemed to understand their moods. It wasn't something he asked out loud, but the way she looped the rope around the young colt's chest, low, across the muscle instead of the bone, told him she had knowledge that came from more than watching. At the table, she ate what was given without waste. She cleaned the tin plates with a precision Elias respected, returning them to the shelf lined up straight. He realized then she wasn't just surviving on his land. She was living like someone determined not to own more than she had to. In town, people would expect her to stay out of sight to hide. But here, she moved freely across the yard. She hauled small loads of wood, mended her own dress with a new needle and thread, and even began patching the holes in Elias's work shirt without asking permission. At first, he was uneasy with it, unsure whether to stop her. Then he saw her work, small, even stitches that held against strain. He didn't thank her in words, but when he pulled the shirt on again, he left it unbuttoned at the collar, letting her see he wore it. That was enough acknowledgement for both. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was practical, filled with the scrape of boots on the ground, the splash of water poured into the trough, the clink of tools set back in their places. Still, Elias found himself watching her at odd moments, searching for signs of strain. He noticed the way she pressed her hand to her ribs when she thought he wasn't looking, or how her eyes scanned the horizon at dusk before she allowed herself to rest. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Elias found himself speaking without planning it. "You planning to move on when you're healed?" Pi didn't answer right away. She was sitting on the low rail, mending the torn edge of the blanket. Finally, she said, "I said I would, but I've nowhere to go." The blunt honesty caught him off guard. Most people would have softened it, asked for his opinion, waited for permission. She didn't. She stated it as fact. Elias weighed his reply. He thought about how the town would twist it if she stayed. More talk, more suspicion, maybe worse. But he also thought about the quiet they had built here in just a few days. It wasn't comfort. Neither of them lived with illusions about that, but it was steadiness. "You can stay until you decide otherwise," he said finally. "No one here's driving you out." Pahi looked at him then, her eyes holding his for longer than before. Not gratitude, not relief. Just a kind of recognition, like she understood exactly what his words meant. That night, she didn't sleep in the shed. She brought her blanket to the small house, laying it against the far wall without asking. Elias didn't stop her. He left the door unlatched so the air could pass through. And for the first time in years, the house felt less like a place for waiting and more like a place meant to hold people. Elias lay awake on his cot longer than usual. He thought about how quickly things had shifted, about how easily survival had tied them together without either of them agreeing to it. The town would see it as trouble, but here, in the quiet, it was something else. Not a promise, not yet, but a start. The heat sat heavy over the yard when two riders came in from a southern trail. Elias noticed them before they reached the fence. Dust hanging behind their horses, the slow, careful gait of men who wanted to look casual but weren't. He set down the bucket he had been filling and straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. Pahi was by the corral, brushing the gelding's flank. She stiffened the moment she saw the strangers. Her hand paused on the brush, her body angled, as if deciding whether to vanish into the house or stay visible. The riders stopped just short of the gate. One was long-faced, missing a front tooth, his hat too low to hide the sharpness in his eyes. The other wore a red kerchief around his neck, sweat stains darkening his shirt. Their horses shifted restlessly, kicking at the dust. "Afternoon," the toothless one called. His voice carried an easy drawl that felt false. "We're looking for someone." Elias didn't move closer. He leaned his arm on the fence rail, steady. "Plenty of someone's out here. Who's it you think you'll find?" The rider tipped his head toward Pahi without looking directly at her. "Heard tell a Comanche girl came this way. Word is, she ran off owing a trader south of here. He's put a price on her head. We're just here to see if that's true." Pahi's hand tightened on the brush. Elias saw it, the way her knuckles whitened. She didn't speak, but her stance made clear what their words cost her. Elias kept his tone level. "This is my land. She's under my roof. There's no bounty business here." The man with the kerchief gave a short laugh. "Sheriff might see it different. Paper's paper, even if you don't like the name on it." Elias let the silence stretch. He weighed his options. If he showed anger, it would feed theirs. If he showed fear, they'd press harder. He needed them to leave, believing the ground here wasn't worth standing on. His mind ran through the sheriff's warning, through the town's whispers. This was the first test, and he couldn't falter. Sheriff's free to ride out and see for himself. Elias said finally. His voice was calm, but there was weight in it. Till then, no one crosses this fence. The toothless rider's jaw worked as if chewing on the words. His eyes flicked from Elias to Pahi and back again. He spat into the dust, then tugged his reins. We'll be back. Don't get too comfortable with her. Comfort's a thing that doesn't last. With that, the two of them turned their horses and rode off, dust rising behind them like a warning left hanging. When the sound of hooves faded, Elias turned to Pahi. She hadn't moved. Her eyes stayed fixed on the empty trail, her grip still locked on the brush. You know those men? Elias asked quietly. She shook her head once, slow. No, but I know men like them. Elias studied her. He wanted to press. Who had marked her, who had cast her out, what price they thought she owed. But he stopped himself. She wasn't ready to tell it, and forcing her would only build another wall between them. What mattered now was that the threat had been named, and the land around them wasn't as empty as before. Keep close to the house, Elias said finally. If they come again, it'll be louder than this. Pahi met his eyes, her chin lifting the slightest bit. She wasn't afraid in the way some would be. She was angry that her presence brought riders to his fence, angry that men thought they could put a price on her life. That anger steadied her, and Elias recognized it because he carried the same kind. As dusk settled, Elias walked the fence line, checking each rail, driving down the posts where they'd loosened. Pahi followed without being asked, carrying nails, steadying boards. She didn't ask if she should stay. She acted as though the answer was already given. And in truth, it was. That night, while coyotes cried on the flats, Elias sat by the stove with his shotgun laid across his lap. Pahi lay on the cot near the wall, her breathing uneven at first, then settling. Elias stayed awake long after, watching the door, listening for hooves. The riders might come back, or they might not. But now he knew for certain. Keeping her here wasn't just about kindness. It was about standing his ground. The riders didn't return that night, but their shadow lingered over the homestead. Elias kept the shotgun within reach, his eyes drifting to the door whenever the wind rattled the boards. By morning, the quiet of the flats returned, yet unease sat in his chest like a stone. Pahi rose to work beside him as usual, but Elias noticed her steps falter more often. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and carried the bucket as if it weighed twice what it did the day before. When she set it down, her breath came ragged, and a faint sheen of sweat lined her forehead, though the morning was still cool. You're pushing too hard, Elias said, but she shook her head. I can work. It wasn't defiance, it was survival. He recognized the tone. He'd spoken to himself once, years back, when fever gripped him on a cattle drive, and he was too afraid to slow down. He didn't press her then, but he watched close. By midday, her hand trembled so badly she dropped the brush while grooming the colt. That was enough. Inside, Elias said firmly. Pahi looked up, her lips parted to argue, then closed again when she saw his face. She walked into the house without another word and lowered herself to the cot. Elias touched her forehead and felt the heat rising off her skin. The wound on her shoulder was no longer just healing, it was inflamed. He boiled water, stripped the bandage, and cleaned the cut as best he could. The flesh was angry, red around the edges. Pahi winced, but did not cry out. Her jaw set hard, and her hand clutched the blanket until her knuckles turned pale. Elias worked slow and careful, cooling her skin with cloths dipped in water, muttering plain words when her breath came too fast. Steady now. Easy. You'll get through it. She mumbled in Comanche, words he didn't understand, her voice broken by the fever. Elias stayed close, repeating the few things he could offer in English, short, grounding phrases. You're safe. Drink. Rest. The hours stretched long. As night fell, her fever climbed. She shivered violently, her body twisting against the blanket. Elias kept the cloth pressed to her skin, his own shirt damp with sweat, his hands raw from wringing water over and over. Each time she cried out, something inside him pulled tight. He remembered faces from his past, the woman he had left, his brother's last hours, moments when he hadn't been able to stop the end from coming. The weight of those failures pressed heavy, but this time he refused to turn away. Near dawn, the fever broke. Pahi's body stilled, her breath evening in a shallow but steady pulls of air. She looked drained, her face pale, her hair stuck to her temples but alive. Elias sat back on the stool, his shoulders slumping, the first true exhale escaping him in hours. When her eyes cracked open, she looked at his hands before his face. He was rolling a fresh strip of cloth, slow and careful. She blinked, then gave a faint nod. No words, just acknowledgement. A recognition of debt, or maybe of trust. Elias returned the nod. Nothing more needed to be said. He stayed awake beside her until the sun rose fully. Outside, the yard was quiet, the fence line untouched, the cattle calm. Inside, the house held a stillness Elias hadn't felt in years. Not emptiness, but something closer to purpose. For the first time since she arrived, he believed she might not just survive the week. She might belong here as much as he did. By the end of the week, Pahi was steady on her feet again. The fever had left her drained, her ribs still sore when she drew deep breaths, but she moved with a stubborn determination that Elias recognized. She refused to remain on the cot. By the second morning after her recovery, she was back at the corral with the brush in her hand, working slower but no less precise. Elias kept his eye on her, uneasy at how quickly she pushed herself. He knew fever left its mark. Still, when she looked up and caught him watching, her eyes were sharp, unyielding. "I will not lie here waiting to be weak," she said simply. He didn't argue. That day, while they mended tack in the shade of the shed, Pahi broke the silence. "I want to go into town." Elias set the leather strap down, narrowing his eyes. "You've barely healed. No reason to stir trouble." "There is reason," she said. "You brought me once, and they saw me as if I were shame. If I hide now, they will make me smaller with their words. I will stand where they can see me." Her voice was low but firm, and Elias realized what was at stake for her. She had been cast out by her own kin. She would not be erased here too. He considered the risk. What would it mean to walk her through the center of town again? What rumors would grow? But her resolve was unshakable. In the end, he saddled the horses without further protest. The ride was quiet, each of them fixed on their own thoughts. As they neared the store, Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The town would watch. He braced himself for it. The bell over Mrs. Ruiz's store rang as they stepped inside. Pahi walked ahead of him this time, her back straight despite the faint hitch in her step. She stopped at the counter, pointed to a spool of strong thread and a sharper needle. Her voice was clear when she asked for them. Elias counted the coins onto the counter, but Mrs. Ruiz's eyes never left Pahi. After a moment, the older woman wrapped the items carefully and pushed them across the counter without a word. Two men by the stove tried to laugh, the same as before. This time Pahi turned her head slowly, meeting their eyes. She didn't speak, didn't scowl, just held their gaze until the laugh faltered and dried in their throats. Elias saw it happen and felt a grim satisfaction. Sheriff Calder entered then, his boots heavy against the floorboards. He looked from Pahi to Elias, weighing the air. "Everything easy here?" he asked. Elias nodded. "It is." Pahi echoed. "It is." The sheriff studied them both for a long moment, then turned his gaze to the men by the stove. "County's got no law against a man letting someone mend a shirt on his porch," he said, his tone deliberate. The words settled heavy in the room. The men shifted uncomfortably and found other things to look at. Mrs. Ruiz, who rarely showed more than practicality, gave the faintest smile as she packed the bundle. Outside, the sun struck hard, but Pahi's steps were steady as they crossed the street to the horses. Elias untied the reins and helped her mount, careful of her ribs. She didn't look back at the store, but her chin stayed high, her eyes forward. On the ride home, Elias spoke only once. "You made your point." Pahi's answer was quiet but firm. "I will not live in someone else's shadow." Elias didn't reply. He didn't need to. He understood. By the time the homestead came into view again, Elias felt the change as clearly as the shifting wind. Pahi wasn't just surviving under his roof anymore. She was claiming her place, step by step, in the open. The peace didn't last long. 3 evenings after their trip to town, Elias spotted dust rising off the southern trail again. This time, it wasn't just 2 riders. 3 men came into view, moving with that same false ease, spreading out as they neared the homestead. The lead rider wore a clean vest that didn't belong on a trail, too polished, too deliberate. Elias recognized the type, a man who dealt in papers and claims, not sweat and stock. Elias leaned his arms on the corral rail, watching. Pahi stepped out of the house when she heard the hooves. She froze for a moment, then moved to stand by the doorway, her body framed by the lamp inside. He gave her a look, silent but clear. Stay where they could see her, but close enough to retreat. The men stopped at the fence. The clean-vested one spoke first. "Name's Collier. I'm here on behalf of a trader down south. Says that girl there owes him for food and shelter. Says she ran without paying. Got papers to prove it." He pulled a folded sheet from his pocket, waving it as if it were gospel. Elias didn't move. Paper's worth nothing if it claims a person has debt. Collier smirked, swinging the paper between 2 fingers. "Law might say different. Sheriff might too. You hand her over now. We'll be on our way." Pi's breath caught, but she didn't step back. Her chin lifted, though Elias could see her hand grip the doorframe tight. Elias kept his voice low, even. "You're not taking anyone from this land. Not tonight, not any night." He shifted the shotgun into his hands, holding it low but steady. Not a threat, just a line drawn clear enough to see. Before the men could answer, the sound of hooves came fast from the wash. Sheriff Calder rode up with Mrs. Ruiz's oldest boy trailing behind on a mule. Dust clung to their boots and coats, proof they'd ridden hard. The boy looked nervous, but Calder was calm, eyes sharp. "What's the matter here?" the sheriff asked. Collier straightened in his saddle. "This man's harboring a runaway. She owes south. I got papers." He waved them again. Calder didn't even look at them. "No one in this county gets claimed like a sack of grain. You've got a complaint, you take it to the court in Santa Fe. Not to me, not to him." The toothless rider spat into the dirt, restless. "She's worth money. Ain't right letting her hide here." Calder's eyes hardened. "She's not hiding. She's standing in plain sight. And I'm saying it plain. Any man who tries to drag her off this land tonight will wake up in a cell tomorrow." Silence stretched. Collier's smirk faltered. He looked at Elias, at the steady shotgun, at Pahi framed in the lamplight, and then at Calder, who didn't blink. The clean vest wasn't enough to protect him out here. He knew it. Finally, Collier tucked the paper back into his vest. "We'll be back with proper claim," he muttered. Calder shook his head. "Don't waste the ride. County won't back you. And if you set foot here again, bring your own shovel." The words landed hard. Collier scowled but tugged his reins. The 3 men turned their horses, riding back into the dark. Their silhouettes faded against the horizon, their promises left with no teeth. When the sound of hooves was gone, Pahi stepped out from the doorway, her face pale but set. Calder dismounted, giving Elias a long look. "You've stirred up talk, but tonight's over. They won't risk more here. Not with witnesses." He gestured to Mrs. Ruiz's boy, who was still gripping the mule's reins like he expected a gunfight. Elias nodded once. "Appreciate you coming." Calder adjusted his hat. "Just remember, Carver, some fights end at the fence. Others follow you into town. You best be ready for both." With that, he rode off into the night, the boy trailing after. Elias lowered the shotgun and turned to Pai. She hadn't moved closer, but her eyes locked on his. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. What had happened was no longer just her fight. It was theirs. That night, Elias sat by the stove long after she had lain down. He thought about Collier's paper, about the traders who believed people could be bought twice, and about the line he had drawn with no way to erase it. He had chosen his side, and so had she. For the first time, Elias felt that the quiet they shared was no longer fragile. It had been tested, and it held. The morning after the standoff came clear and sharp, the air cooler than it had been in days. Elias stepped out into the yard, scanning the horizon out of habit. No dust trails, no riders, only the quiet hum of the land. The cattle moved slow at the trough. The corral stood solid. For the first time since Pahi had arrived, The place felt like it might hold steady. Inside, Pahi was already on her feet, folding the blanket she had used as if she meant to prove she wasn't a burden. The fever had left its mark. Her movements were slower, her strength not fully back. But there was something different in her face. She looked less like someone passing through and more like someone taking account of what was hers. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee, set one on the table near her, and spoke without looking up. Collier won't come back. Not after last night. You believe that? She asked. I do. Sheriff drew the line for him. Men like that don't like to push when the law is set against them. They'd rather pray where no one's watching. Pahi sat down slowly, wrapping her hands around the tin cup. Then what now? I can go, if that's what you need. I won't have them saying you're cursed because of me. Elias studied her for a long moment. He thought about what the town already said about him, how the whispers never left him no matter what he did. They had called him reckless, dangerous, cursed long before she set foot at his gate. If he let her leave now, he would only be confirming every word they ever said, that Elias Carver couldn't hold on to anything worth holding. You can stay, he said, not because of pity, not because of debt, because this place is mine, and you belong here if you choose it. Pahi's eyes lifted, searching his face for weakness, for hesitation. She found none. If I stay, she said carefully, I want my name here, not as someone you shelter, as someone who stands beside you. Elias leaned back in his chair. Then we'll ride into town, make it plain to everyone. That afternoon, they saddled the horses and rode in together. The streets were quiet, townsfolk watching from shaded porches as they dismounted in front of the justice's office. Calder was there, leaning on the rail as if he had been waiting. He gave Elias a long look, then tipped his hat toward Pahi. You ready to set this straight? The sheriff asked. Elias nodded. We are. Inside, the justice of the peace, a tired man with ink-stained fingers, drew up a simple record. No rings, no ceremony, just names written beside each other in a ledger. 2 witnesses signed. Mrs. Ruiz, who had followed them across the street with her apron still on, and Sheriff Calder, who scrawled his name with the weight of finality. No one asked questions. No one dared. When it was done, Pahi stepped outside into the sunlight with her chin high, her name now bound to this place in writing as much as in choice. Elias tied the papers carefully and slid them into his coat pocket. The ride home was silent, but it wasn't the silence of caution anymore. It was the kind that comes when nothing more needs saying. Back at the homestead, Elias fetched a strip of iron he had set aside from old tools. He worked at it with hammer and chisel, scratching Pahi's name deep into its surface. When it was done, he bolted it to the corral gate where anyone who passed could read it. The mark wasn't just for the cattle. It was for them. As the sun dropped, they ate at the table together. The quiet was steady, shared on purpose. There were no riders at the fence, no fever in her skin, no debt hanging over the land. The house felt different now. No longer a shelter for 2 strays, but a place where both had chosen to stay. For Elias, it was the first time in years he hadn't thought about leaving. For Pahi, it was the first time since her exile she felt claimed by more than pain. And as the night settled over the flats, the story that had begun with a stranger at the gate ended with a door left open, a corral marked with her name, and a life they would now carry forward together.